So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for doing this. This is going to be great. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. So I think it's really useful, especially for people who are early in their research journey, to hear about the experiences of others and how they ended up in the area of research that they did. So I'd love to hear a bit about the trajectory of your career and how you became interested in and now doing so much to advance replication, reproduction, and open science.
Yeah, this brings me back, I guess, to my PhD, or even maybe before, I guess. The moment I really started being interested in open science, I mean, open science was not a thing. This is back in 2010 or 2011. I'm getting old now. But I remember doing a master thesis, and I was interested in the impact of smoking bans, public smoking in public places in the US, and the impact on smoking prevalence. And I remember running hundreds and hundreds of regressions. And it would be back then in Paris and just running them or running them. And I couldn't find an effect. It was never significant. And the effect was like sometimes positive, sometimes negative. It was all over the place, but never significant. Until at one point I found the specification that led to a negative effect, quite large and significant. And I remember being in the library and just being so happy and just shouting it, yes, I got it. And then a couple of hours later, the next day, or I don't remember who I was talking to, maybe the person who was supervising my master thesis, I forget. But I was like, this is stupid. Like, what am I doing? Like, I've ran like countless models and there's never an effect. And yet there's this huge literature in public health that tells me that I should find an effect, that smoking bans in public places needs to lead to a decrease in smoking prevalence. And that's the moment I started thinking about publication bias and about p-hacking, which I was doing. And I started like looking for papers on these topics. And like the expression p-hacking did not exist back then. So people were talking more about specification insertion. But in my own discipline in economics, I could find maybe 3, 4 papers on this topic that were from like the 80s, 90s. And I was like, wow, nobody actually seems to care about this. And then I started the PhD, I did the coursework, and then my first week of actually being in an office with other like PhD students and being interested in like doing research, for whatever reason, we started talking about like this idea of like, you can generate p-values by just running regressions and then cherry pick some. And I remember we had a blackboard and we just wrote on the blackboard what the distribution of p-values would look like in economics if you would look at it. And we thought like there would be a huge jump at like 10%, another jump at 5%, etc. And then a couple of days later, I just told them like, are we doing this paper? Like, are we like collecting p-values in published articles and actually documenting this? And they were up for it. So like, a bunch of PhD students just started like collecting thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of p-values. I think at the end we had like 50,000 from like hundreds of studies. It took us like 6 months each of just like reading these papers, doing this manually, grabbing them and then grabbing author characteristics, who are these people, looking at their CV and so on and so on. Anyway, months of my life basically doing this. And then we had this Z curve where, anyway, let's say T statistics, where there's just a huge jump near 1.96. And I remember like being like, oh, this is kind of cool. And we called the paper Star Wars, The Empiric Strikes Back. And there were like quotes in the paper. We start with like lyrics from a song. And at one point, I remember putting like a quote from like Da Vinci, who's like fixed to a star, does not change his mind. Anyway, the paper is just complete madness if you think about it. But it was like on tons of blogs. And it's just like people like the title, etc. And I sort of like didn't think too much about this. We got rejected at every top journal in economics. And at one point I sort of gave up even on the paper. I remember like we sort of took years to publish it. But I sort of stopped working on that topic just because I didn't think it would be important. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think like it would have an impact. And it's years later, even like going to conferences, people were like, "Oh, you're one of the Star Wars guy." I realized like how big actually that paper was. But it took me forever to sort of realize. And my three co-authors never wrote another paper on this topic. Whereas after a couple of years, I started thinking, like, oh, wow, maybe this thing matters. Like I visited at one point during my PhD UC Berkeley, and one professor there, Ted Miguel, just like when I showed him the graph, he just went crazy. He just like, let me send this to everyone. This is amazing. And I remember receiving an email from someone I'd called Tech, Colin Kammer, who just said like, this is a great paper. And that like it took me like more senior people who could see like what was going on and being interested in it to sort of realize, okay, actually I'm onto something. And I sort of never really understood it. So I guess nowadays I even sometimes send emails like PhD student, hey, just saw your new discussion paper. I don't know you, but I think it's really cool. And to me, it makes a huge difference. And I think we have a big problem in academia of like not actually telling someone that we actually enjoy their work. We're really good at actually trashing the work of other people with anonymous referee reports. But I think it's really important for senior people to actually encourage juniors and telling them like, no, this is actually a really interesting idea. This is novel and you should push for it. So anyway, so this is how I got interested into this whole world of research transparency, sort of by accident, if you will.
It's a really interesting backstory because I think a lot of us can relate to really getting excited about something that is not even well defined, not even well understood, hacking your way through it, having no response, and then eventually someone being like, actually, wow, yeah, I finally see it too. That mix of the moment and your own curiosity. One of the things that you mentioned towards the end was hearing from other people about the significance of this. And we see it too here, the coming generation of academics being very, very interested in these issues and this work. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how issues of p-hacking, publication bias, and the like affect the coming generation of academics and then the public as a whole.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think people realize what it means or the impacts that it can have. And I think it's because most people who start doing research, I think are just trying to do good. They're trying to do good research and they have good intentions. But I think they don't realize that their behavior and the behavior of other people potentially leads them into cherry picking some results. Or maybe when they look at a policy or they're interested in documenting the effect of X on Y, if they don't find an effect, they might scrap that paper. And that's problematic. And I know why people are doing it, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this later on. But it's problematic because then we don't have a full picture or portray of like what's going on in a specific literature. We only have part of it. And that part is maybe only the studies that find an effect. So if you think of like a big literature, I don't know, I'm an economist, so I'm going to give an example in economics, but the effect of the minimum wage on unemployment. Well, we could have potentially only studies that find a specific effect in a specific direction. And all the people who are actually starting to look at the data and the codes might actually stop doing research when they don't find an effect that goes into this direction. Or they might try to p-hack to try to get to that. And they only show the specifications where this is confirming what we have in the literature, or confirming their priors, or confirming what their political party or the people that, implement policy, what they want to hear. So all these biases are really important, and they're called publication bias, which englobes a lot of things and can just lead to very incomplete picture. And this is from an academic point of view. So researchers in general would publish research potentially that as a globe, like as a corpus of research, would be biased. But then other people looking at this literature, it could be policymakers, it could be just a public, it could be anyone looking at this has, oh, wow, actually people in academia sort of ended up on the consensus. They always find that the effect of this on this is that. But actually it's wrong. It's not that we ended up on this, it's that we ended up doing research that is biased. So the research can be biased for many reasons. And it can be biased because of the publication bias that I mentioned, but also sometimes your research might be biased and you've done nothing wrong. And an example is sometimes you will look at the literature because you want to know, okay, what should I control for? How should I call my dependent variable? How should I call my independent variable? And you're going to try to look for other papers that have looked at similar research question. And you're going to try to do the same. But by doing the same, maybe you're actually doing the same as someone else who has PIAC'd and sort of cheated a bit. And without even noticing, you might actually engage in PIACing just by following the literature. So I think people like need to understand that a lot of what people call PIACing, so basically cherry picking a p-value in order to show that the effect is statistically significant, is done often subconsciously, and often it's not even sort of your fault. You're not even aware that you're actually doing this. And sometimes it's projects over years. And it's with tons of co-authors, and it's like tons of decisions that are made over time, and you don't even realize that at the end of the day, all these decisions sum up to actually PIACing. But if I would ask you, did you PIAC? I'd be like, no way, I've never, like, what are you talking about? But like, well, yeah, but if I follow up all your decisions and I look at the final product, you're showing that specification here, but you could have shown all these other specifications that show an effect that is different. So to answer your question, I guess, which I should, is policymakers and the general public are seeing only a subset of studies and are seeing studies potentially that are biased. And this has consequences for the type of for knowledge accumulation, but also for the type of policies that we may implement.
And the integrity of academia.
Yes.
You founded and chair the Institute for Replication. Can you tell us a bit about how the Institute approaches scaling replication studies, and then how academics can be involved?
For sure. So I guess a bit of backstory. So at one point I got tenured and I was getting sabbatical, and I was like, oh, you know, now is the moment to actually do something that could have an impact. And I thought to myself, like, I'll just launch an institute and let's try to mass reproduce and replicate as many studies as possible. So anyway, so that was the initial goal, and that's still the goal. But when I launched the institute, we couldn't get any funding. So we were 0 for 15 on funding applications. We would always get killed on the idea that replications and reproductions are not like important and they don't lead to innovation. So that would always be the type of comments that we would get. So, but nonetheless, I realized that you can do a lot of good work with 0 funding. So the first year and a bit, so this is back in 2022 when I launched the Institute. So it's been 2.5 years. We initially had a board of top economists, top political scientists. And what I would do is to ask them for names of researchers that could be interested in doing reproductions. And then I would give them like a list of studies in public health, a list of studies in American politics and labor economics, et cetera. And they would tell me like, oh, for that specific study, this person could be a good replicator. So I started sort of thinking of, instead of trying to find referees, let's look at published papers and let's try to find replicators. And then I would contact them. I would tell them, here's a paper. We think you could be a good fit. Would you be interested in looking at the data in the codes, checking for coding errors? Can you run the codes? Are the results robust to reasonable changes in the specification? So this is how we sort of got started. And then at one point I was invited for 2 seminars in Oslo in Norway. And it was one on Friday, one on Wednesday, one on Friday. And then I asked, what do we do on Thursday? And he basically, the person who invited me sort of told me like, oh, you could go maybe, I don't know, like see the Vikings Museum or something like this. And then I pitched the idea, well, we could do a quick workshop, just a 1-day workshop where you and I and other people would just reproduce a couple of papers. And then I remember we had a social media account back then, and we just released one tweet saying, hey, we're going to do this reproducibility workshop, which I call Replication Games. And if you want to come, you're welcome. We're going to reproduce a couple of papers. Should be fun. And then within like 72 hours, we had 70 people coming from all over Europe and the UK who were interested. And I just closed registration and I realized I don't know what I'm doing. We don't have food. We don't have room. We have no budget. But anyway, that didn't stop us. But what we ended up doing, and now we're doing this all the time. So this year we have 28 replication games in tons of countries with over 1,300 researchers who are participating in these. So they're PhD students and faculty. But anyway, basically people register to an event and what they can, so they tell us what they're comfortable with, Stata, R, Python, etc. Their research interests, and then we match them with people with similar research interests. And then they spend the day actually running the codes, looking for coding errors, doing robustness checks, etc., etc. So now this is how we We generate most of the reproductions, replications. So we started with economics, political science. Now we're doing also psychology. Soon, I'm hopeful we're going to do public health and ecology, environment. So this should be early 2025. So the goal is to do more and more disciplines. But for economics, to give you an example, if you look at the like 8 top journals in economics, we're reproducing, doing robustness checks for something like 20-25% of all the papers that have data. For political science, we're doing something like 30-40 per year, so it's less. For psychology, we have partnership with 2 journals, Nature Human Behavior and Psychological Science, and we're trying to mass reproduce everything that they publish. So we focus on recent studies, and the goal is really to mass reproduce, to do as much as possible in order to change the norms, in order that people are actually aware that someone else is going to look at your work if you publish in a top journal. And this changes then the way they're going to conduct the research, hopefully. So if you're an economist and you publish in a top journal and you're using data, you know, the likelihood you will get an email from me at one point down the line is quite high. And I will tell you, hey, we had like 3 researchers or 4 researchers looking at your data in the codes, doing robustness checks. Here's a 15 pages long report commenting on your work. Do you want to respond? So this is what I do pretty much on a full-time basis now. We run these events. We have people contacting us or giving them, like, assign them a study. And then when they're done with their analysis, I reach out to the authors to allow them to respond. And then we release both the response and the report publicly on our website, discussion papers, preprint series, and also on social media.
In addition to this massive work around replication, you've also been producing a whole series of papers, really looking at, and you began to describe it in the first question, this sort of building of a corpus of a whole lot of articles and the effects found, and being able to document that and create a whole corpus of articles that you've been working with. So I'd really like to hear some of the different sources those came from, why you chose what you did, being able to sort of build out the data set that you've been using to really explore some of the mechanisms of publication bias and p-hacking.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So usually what we do in order to document publication bias is we're going to be looking at hundreds of studies in a specific discipline. What some researchers are doing, which is better, often they look at a specific meta-analysis, that all the studies look at the same research question. But what I've done in my work is more generally just let's look at top journals in a specific discipline. Let's take studies that were published, let's say between 2005, 2011, and let's read all of them. And then it's grabbing information from these studies, coefficient, standard errors, if there are confidence intervals, p-values, so information like this. And by doing this, then it gives you a lot of information about the study itself. And then you can pull it off into a big data set where you're going to have these p-values, these coefficients for a very large number of studies. And by looking at hundreds of studies, you're going to have enough statistical power to sort of being able to look at what's going on in terms of the distribution of test statistics. And there are tools that have been developed over the years that allow you, or methods that allow you to detect specification searching, publication bias, and to quantify it. So these are the type of studies that I do. And there is one study in particular that is a bit different. So we collaborated with an editor-in-chief at one journal. And what we ended up doing was we managed to get access to the manuscripts that are published. Obviously, these are publicly available, but also those that are rejected. And we knew whether they were desk rejected or referee rejected. And I didn't get to see those, but co-authors who are on the board of the journal did. So we did the same. We read these papers. I read the accepted ones. I didn't read the other ones. But we're able to look at the distribution of p-values and test statistics and economics for a journal, a leading journal, and understanding, okay, so which paper gets this rejected, which paper gets referee rejected, and which one actually are getting accepted, and whether the distribution of p-values varies depending on which type of results you have. And I, happy to talk about the results here, but that was quite unique in order to understand like what's going on in terms of peer review. And obviously it's not causal, the paper that potentially, or papers that are DES rejected. What we found, for instance, is that they tend to PAC more. So there's a huge bunching around 10%. These papers tend to be more DES rejected. They might be DES rejected for other reasons. Maybe the quality of the paper is just lower in general. But I think there's something to it. Like we have 25 co-editors making decisions in the database. Like we have hundreds of studies that were submitted to the journal. And one pattern that you start seeing is if it's really PAC'd, some co-editors are able to detect this and they're going to DES reject the manuscript. Whereas then when it goes to the next stage that it's sent to referees, actually referees like it when its status is significant, borderline. So the editors and the referees are sort of behaving in different ways. They're interested in different things. Obviously, the referees only see papers that are not DES rejected, so they're not seeing the same pool of papers. But I feel it was quite interesting and completely different than my priors. And it's kind of funny, if you look at the journal, you look at the overall impact, the referees and the editors are sort of canceling each other. And at the end, the initial distribution is very similar to the distribution that is actually published, because in between you had these two, forces that are going in different directions. So it was quite interesting to document this. But the main result of that paper, and something I deeply believe in, is most of the specification searching is before submitting. It's not the referee process itself that's going to lead you to more specification searching. It's really happening before you submit. And we find similar patterns, for instance, when you look at preprints and working papers. So people do this, potentially thinking that the editors and the referees want to see significant results. And they're going to trash their work if they don't find an effect. But this is thinking that the editors are going to do this. So they do it before actually the editors are actually making it happening. And we did a survey. We asked economists who publish in leading journals, do they believe that there's actually this happening? And yeah, they think that editors and referees prefer statistically significant results. And actually, it's not true. The editors don't. And it's quite interesting because when you even ask people, like, are you scrapping papers where you don't find an effect? Have you done this recently? Many say yes, they do. And I don't think they feel bad about it. I think it's just the norm. If you don't find an effect, you're just thinking like, nah, it's never going to get published. Let's not dig deeper here. This is research that nobody's going to be interested in. But that's actually a big problem. I would argue we need that research to be out there and to get published.
Oh, one of the things that really struck me in reading through your papers was the elegance of being able to look at bunching of results at the significance thresholds. But you've also talked about there are other forms, or there are other ways that p-hacking can manifest in what you're actually looking at in the data. There are other ways that publication bias shows up, and some of those have less developed methods for being able to spot them. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what can be seen with current empirical approaches and how well this does at defining the nature and the scope of the problems.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a tricky question. I mean, one thing I'm going to say is some people, especially in psychology, I would say, have methods that they argue allow them to see whether a specific study is PAC'd or not. I don't buy this. I don't think you can look at one study with any tools, with any type of certainty saying that study is PAC'd. I don't think you can. I think you need a corpus. You need many studies from the same authors or different authors, and then you're going to see a pattern, and then you can make conclusions or claims. But I think all these methods that try to do it for one paper, I think it's really problematic. You don't have enough information. In terms of methods, I think, one of the big limitations of my work is it's really hard to document different forms of p-hacking. And most of my work and the work of most people in this domain is more looking at what I refer to as marginal p-hacking. Is you have a p-value, it's around 0.15, let's say, or 0.20, and maybe you work so much and you're trying to move it to having a borderline significant effect. That I think you can see in the data because the bunching is going to be there, and you're going to see like there's missing p-values here. There's too many here. There seems to be something going on. Is it the authors? Is it the referees? Is it the editors? That we don't know. And that's why I was interested in collaborating with a journal. I think it's the authors mostly. in response to thinking that the editors and the referees are going to be happy with that. But I think this you can document. I don't think you can really document really well taking a p-value of 1 and bringing it to 0.05. It's such a large movement. It would be incredibly hard to document something like this. So I think most of the p-hacking and specification searching that we can document in publication bias is more like at the margin. It's not like extreme taking a p-value of 1 and bringing it to like 0. Are people doing that? Are researchers actually engaging in behavior like this? I think some are, but I think most of the research, let's say bias that is happening is more, I think, at the margin, at least in my own discipline, because you're not collecting new data. I think it's sort of different a bit if you talk about like management, marketing, psychology, where they have a sample size of 71 collected on MTurk. They don't explain you how they ended up with that 71 observations. There's no discussion of power. You have no idea if they've done attention tests, and they find an effect of 0.05. I think there I could see how you move something from 1 to 0.05. I could see it. So there I feel like other methods are necessary. So I would never take like the methods I develop and really using them to try to investigate something like psychology and claiming, and the N is important. So I've used my methods on other disciplines, but you cannot claim that you're going to capture all of the, let's say, bad behavior that is happening. That is impossible. So there's many methods. They all have different limitations. You need to look at many different methods to try to have a better portrait. But I think there's some behavior and some of the publication bias happening that you cannot capture. There's no test that's going to be able to capture all of it. And I think there's actually a lot of really bad tests out there that have been developed over time. But anyway, it's based on preferences and what you're trying to capture, I would say.
So I think a lot of what you have been producing in the last several years is really new empirical research into these topics and leading a lot of what is happening and what is being understood about these phenomena. So having done this work, what's lined up with what was sort of suspected in the field, what your own expectations were, and what's been really unexpected or different from how you saw it previously?
Yeah, I think I used to be a big believer in pre-registration and pre-analysis plan. I still believe, but I don't think right now, if I see a study that is pre-registered or has a pre-analysis plan, I put more credibility on that study than a study that is not. I don't. I think maybe one day we will get to that point, but I think pre-registration, pre-analysis plan are not right now the way they're being used useful in decreasing or increasing credibility in science. I don't think they are. And so what I did in a project recently was looking at every single pre-registration, or let's put it differently. I looked at all the randomized controlled trials that were done in economics and published in top 25 journals in economics. I look at all of them, and we ran with co-authors all the pre-registration. And usually economists use the American Economic Association RCT registry. And what's key in what I just said is it's a registry. It's not a pre-registration platform. So what economists do is, and some journals force them to do, is they collect the data, they analyze the data, and then they release or they post a registration of their RCT. But then it would put in the acknowledgement footnote, a RCT number, etc. And people, I think, would think of this as a pre-registration. It's not. It's registered after the fact. So that's one of the big problems. Another problem that we start to document more and more is in psychology and other disciplines. Sometimes people post multiple pre-registrations that are different at the same time. And then they're only going to say in the published article that they register at one place. But actually, they can choose which of the 4 or 5 pre-registration that they've done. And this, I have direct evidence of this. We had a team in Munich. We had replication games in Munich recently that uncovered this. And so it's happening. People are actually doing this. They're sort of cheating by having too many pre-registration, and they only cherry pick the one that actually fits what they end up doing in the final analysis. So I think there's lots of problems. I could go on for hours. I think these bad pre-registration, which unfortunately happen a lot, are just bad apples there's also good apples, but what you see is just the set of apples. So I think we just have bad information. So when you're seeing that a study is pre-registered, you think, oh, wow, they've done a good job. They're being transparent. Clearly, they didn't deviate from it. It's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I'll be frank, I don't buy it anymore. I don't. I think it's a shame. I think pre-registration, pre-analysis plan has a lot of positive, like there's a lot of pros. There's also cons. Some people don't like exploration. I love exploration. So I think you just need to be clear about how you deviate it. And I think in economics, that's the way to do it. In psychology, if you do this, people are going to be mad for the most part. So I feel like there's big differences across fields. But I would say like pre-registration is just not being used properly. I think it's a great tool that is just not used properly. In terms of other predictors of like which research is more PIAC, which research suffers more from publication bias. I mean, I've looked at so many subsamples and there's not much. One thing that pops up a lot is method. And in my own discipline, I can tell you that if I see an RCT, randomized control trial, the likelihood that that paper is PIAC or suffers from publication bias is way less, way more credible than for a study that uses something that we call instrumental variable, which always find an effect, and it's always at the 5% level or almost. It's just impossible in economics to use that method and actually publish a null result. Literally impossible. Whereas if you do an experiment in Kenya that took years, and at the end of the day, you don't find an effect, you're going to be able to publish it. So there are some methods where if you find a null effect, you can publish it, and other methods where it's just not happening. And this is really problematic. So I feel method is one of those indicator that you can use that allows you to better understand whether a study is credible or not. And I've changed a lot of my priors were not this. And over time, I sort of see method as something incredibly important, just in terms of credibility. And the credibility is more than just this method is experimental. The other one is not, it's more convincing. It's more than that. It's your capacity to publish null result with an experiment in the social sciences, whereas with non-experimental methods, it's much harder. So you need to find an effect with some of these methods to be able to publish. And this leads to, again, biases, and this impacts, the type of research we put out there, and it impacts policymaking potentially, and just trust in the research that we do.
I think you've really led into at least part of the next question, which is about sort of what are some of the next important steps in understanding p-hacking and publication bias, and what are some of the frontiers that you feel are really important, not just within that, but broadly within open science, data integrity, replication, for developing academics to explore?
I think we've done a good job at documenting the problems. And I still do it. And each time I'm like, why am I doing this? It's so obvious. And then again, once in a while, I get a referee report telling me that there's no publication bias in economics or in academia. I'm like, what? Like, you ask people, like, are you doing this? Or do you think your colleagues are doing this? They say yes. And then out of nowhere, you get these referees of people who are completely denying it. It just, we can argue on like the importance of it, the extent of it. But so I think, I guess we still need research that documents this and documents trying to better understand the determinants. And I think there's an amazing literature right now developing. I think some of it is with AI, and it's like, yeah, but I think just in general, there's a great literature on trying to understand or predicting which study is going to replicate, which study is not, which study is going to be false positives, maybe because of publication bias, and which one is credible and we can buy it. And I think that's a great literature. And if I would be a junior, that's something I would definitely be like attracted to. The other thing is, well, we know there are problems, let's fix them. So I'm more and more interested in how can we change incentives? How can we develop tools that are going to help us to get to a better place? And personally, I've been putting all my, eggs in the same basket. It's mass reproducing, mass replicating. But I think there's tons of other things that can be done. There's collaboration with journals that can happen. There's different things that we can do to change incentives and change the way people do research. And I feel we need more research on this and less research on, let's try to document again all these problems. they exist. We know it. Things are getting better over time, I guess. But like, let's work. Let's spend more time trying to understand the solutions, and how can we change incentives. Like people are trying to do good research, but they also want to get a job. They also want to get like tenure. They want to publish in top journal. They still want to get grants. So, and they think that if they find an effect, it's going to help them doing all of this. We need to change that. And that doesn't mean you need to change the entire system. It means that journals should potentially be more likely to accept null results. And all of this would completely change the incentives. Like you don't need to change the tenure. You don't need to change everything, the way grants operates and all these things. I think you just need to change either like preferences for null results or just being more transparent about the work that you do, encouraging researchers to, instead of just, this is my preferred specification, the significance, like, no, show me the entire thing. Show me you've done 70 regressions. You choose the one maybe in the middle or there because you prefer it, but there's some uncertainty. And I think a lot of people would be interested in that. And I think there's going to be a couple of papers soon that will come out that will do this properly. And then people will be like, oh, wow, we can actually publish papers now where you show that there's uncertainty. And this is the point of Smith I'm showing you, but there's also all these other ones that we ran. Like, I think people are going to be super interested in this. Policymakers are going to be. People were deciding where like donations are going. I'm thinking of like, Open Philanthropy, GiveWell, all these organizations are interested in this, understanding more just the uncertainty of point estimates. I think that's the future. So if I would have a student or someone contacting me saying, hey, where's this field going? I would say, this is where it's going. This is what you need to work on right now.
Thank you so much. It's been very interesting and inspiring, and I'm thrilled to open it up for everyone who's in the audience. I know there are a lot of people here that have put a lot of passion and time and effort into these issues themselves. So I'm very eager to hear what people are thinking.
Yeah, Josh had a question. He wanted me to put the link to the article in the chat. I did it quickly. I put the version where you need to actually be a member of the American Economic Association. You don't need that. If you want to just read the paper, I have it publicly available on my personal webpage.
I'm a little surprised. I really thought there'd be quite a few comments. Okay, Colin, thanks for being the number one.
Sure, take your time, Colin. Yeah, for those of you listening but not seeing the chat, so Colin is writing up the question. So here's the question. When thinking about the distribution of p-hacking, particularly with issues of performing a meta-analysis, do you have any preference over assumptions over the distribution? We could talk about for hours about this. I don't like any theoretical distributions that are derived based on some theorem, or to me, it just doesn't make any sense. The way my co-authors and I started back in 2011 or 2012, I forgot. And I still think is the best thing that you can do is just compute an empirical distribution. So what we ended up doing was to take popular data sets in a specific field. So it was economics. So we took like 3 or 4 really popular data sets that economists use a lot. And we ran millions of regressions at random with variables that made sense. And if you do that, guess what it looks like? It looks like a normal distribution with a fat tail. So sort of Cauchy distribution. And there's no bunching at, 0.05. There's no bunching at 0.10. There's no bunching at all. It just looks like a Cauchy distribution. So basically a distribution with a fat tail. Now, that distribution is an empirical distribution. I really like it. I think it makes a lot of sense. There's tons of other papers like thinking about like, oh yeah, but what if people would be interested only in studying research question where they think there would be an impact? And they're powered at 5%. So you would expect that the distribution would have a spike at 5%, and it's not because of p-anking or publication bias. I think it's a bit of garbage. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I've done in multiple papers looking at which studies say that they have statistical power and which studies say that they don't have statistical power. The studies that have statistical power, that discuss statistical power in management, in economics, in marketing, these studies are not bunch of 0.05. They're the studies that find an effect at 1% or that find no results. Studies that don't talk about powers, don't explain how they came up with their sample size and so on, are the ones that find mysteriously an impact at 5%. But anyway, I'm not really answering your question. I don't personally have preferences about the assumption of the distribution. I don't, just because I don't like these assumptions at all. So I reject these assumptions and I prefer to go with an empirical distribution and just taking data sets that are publicly available and just running regressions. But I could talk for hours about this. I get this in every single referee report, or more or less every single referee report. That's correct. So Colin's asking if I'm hosting the Meta-Analysis MRNet conference next year. So it's going to be in Ottawa. So it's been in Europe for quite some time, and they wanted to bring it to North America. So it should be fun. And the day before the conference, we're going to do replication games, but instead of reproducing studies published in top journal, we're going to reproduce meta papers that are published in leading journals. So we're going to do a meta thing of a meta thing. So in a meta conference. So trying to make it super meta. Maybe it's too much, but we'll do it anyway.
I'll ask one more question. One of the things that we've heard from a number of data editors and other editors at top journals is that, there's already for many articles a fairly limited readership, and that special editions, other sort of attention to findings have performed extremely badly in an already bad environment for a lot of literature. And so it seems like, in addition to the thinking of the researchers and the thinking of the editors, there is also something very, I guess, fundamental in human behavior that's deeply interested in the novel, that resists no news. And so I'm curious how that part factors in this sort of recognition that journals are also enterprises that are trying to get audience, and how you work with their incentives in that space as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what some journals do, like let's talk about comments, matters arising first, replications. So what some journals are doing is they publish it in a separate category. They publish it in the matters arising or comments section or etc. So this doesn't impact their impact factor. So that's the way they go about it. I think a lot of disciplines are not doing this, and that's something I get a lot. People are just saying, I'm not going to publish this. Nobody's going to publish this, going to cite this or read it. The other thing I would push a bit against is we don't have a lot of evidence that this is the case, just because we don't really publish much of these. But from a theoretical point of view, I would agree that it's quite likely that replications or reproduction is probably not going to get cited or read as much. So in terms of incentives, I would say you can have replication journals that are backed by an association. So if you're the APA in psychology, or if you're the AEA in economics, or if you're the whatever association and whatever discipline, you could have a journal that is all for all the comments and for all these things. And that journal is going to be heavily specialized, and it's not going to impact your readership for your flagship journal. It's not going to impact their impact factors, but there's going to be a link between these journals and saying, if you're interested in this paper, just be aware that a comment was published in that other journal. It's backed by an association, so it would have credibility. I think the problem of replication journals in general is they're not backed by an association. There's no credibility. They don't get a lot of submissions, and their goal is by having a journal, they're going to get submissions. It's just not happening. So the business model doesn't work. So that's why I didn't launch a journal. I launched an institute where we're trying to mass reproduce studies. And we work with researchers by giving them an incentive to come to our events and doing a reproduction replication. They get co-authorship to a huge paper that gives co-authorships to all the people who reproduce the paper. And then it's submitted to a journal. So I'm an economist. I'm completely obsessed with incentives. So I get it. I just think there's ways around it. And I think publishing null result can be very interesting. And I would actually argue that sometimes if you publish a null result that goes against a big literature, it's probably going to have a bigger impact and more readership than all these other papers that just confirm that, yes, there's an impact of X on Y. So I think you can have an impact with a null result, but not all results are necessarily interesting. And you could make the point that we publish too many papers in general, and we should publish less papers. And when we publish a paper, we should make sure that it's reproducible, replicable. So you could even have a system in which I'm not going to publish your study until it's actually been reproduced or replicated. So sort of a conditional acceptance, but with a note saying hasn't been reproduced, replicated yet. So there's many different systems that you could have, or different incentives that could be implemented. But I guess it goes to my initial comment that instead of talking about the problems, let's talk about solutions. And I feel there's just no space currently doing this. So I love the question because I don't have a good answer to it. And I feel it's because we spend all our times talking about the problems or just thinking there's no problem. There are problems, and let's have conversations and discussions, and let's publish papers about maybe how we're going to deal with these problems.
All right, last chance for questions. Lynn is also going to put in the chat box link for a quick survey. These are very helpful for us in selecting speakers to hear what people are interested in. So, any last question? Okay, seeing anything?
That's okay.
And let's see, Lynn, I am also not seeing the link. We're also putting a link in there to the YouTube channel where this video, and I believe we are at about 160 research talks, are all posted. So this will be posted within about a week. And we have quite a body now of talks around issues of open science, research data management, including, I'll just plug another one. There's a wonderful talk from the data editor at American Economic Association about sort of that practice of doing replication studies within a top journal and what that actually looks like, and the perspective from having done thousands of these. So Larsville Huber, that's it. So yeah, just a strong recommend to take a look at the range of what people are talking about in this area, because there is such a rich body of rapidly developing but still very unfinished work in this space. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.